Just moments ago, the most carefully guarded walls of Buckingham Palace didn't just crack, they shattered. For decades, the British monarchy has lived by a single, unshakable rule: never complain, never explain. It is a system built on the presentation of an unbreakable facade, a polished image of control and dignity. But today, Princess Catherine has stepped into the cold light of reality with a revelation that exposes the fragile truth hidden behind the velvet curtains. This is not just a routine health update or a sanitized bulletin from the palace press office. This is the moment a system reached its absolute breaking point. For months, the public was fed a carefully curated version of the truth. We were told King Charles was simply resting, recovering from routine fatigue and a planned, successful surgery. We were fed polished lines about privacy and space, while behind the scenes, the palace was working overtime to maintain an illusion that was rapidly disintegrating. Princess Catherine has now confirmed the existence of a secret so profound it was hidden even from the immediate heir to the throne, a sealed letter, left behind by the late Queen Elizabeth II in her final months. This letter was hidden in plain sight, buried among personal keepsakes in a small cedar box that belonged to the Queen. It bore no official royal seal, no markings of the palace institution, only Catherine's name written in the Queen's unmistakable, trembling hand. The moment Catherine's fingers brushed that envelope, she knew she was holding the one thing the palace machine never intended for her to see: a chilling warning about the future of the crown and the vulnerability of the man who currently wears it. To understand this crisis, you must understand that silence in a public institution is rarely about respect. It is about control. The Queen Elizabeth's letter wasn't a collection of fond memories or grandmotherly advice. It was a cryptically foreboding map of a crisis she saw gathering, like shadows around her son. It reveals that the stability we were promised was a house with cracked walls, hidden by beautiful paintings. Tonight, we begin to peel back those layers. We explore the leaks, the fights behind closed doors, and the haunting reality that the Queen's last hope was entrusted to the one woman she believed had the strength to challenge the palace silence. As Princess Catherine opened the envelope under the dim light of her private study, the world she once knew about the royal family shifted forever. This was not merely the fond memories of a dying grandmother. It was a razor-sharp, cold analysis of the cracks threatening the very foundation of the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II, with her legendary clarity preserved until her final breath, had left behind a warning about what she termed an inherited vulnerability in King Charles, a secret the palace had spent decades trying to bury. The letter revealed that Charles's current state was not a sudden medical crisis. Instead, it was the culmination of a long-term consequence, born from the staggering pressures of responsibility since his youth and a legacy of unresolved pain. The Queen had seen these signs long ago, and she feared that the combination of stress, excessive secrecy, and the weight of legacy had created an irreversible toll within her successor. Most alarmingly, the Queen directly addressed Diana, the woman whose ghost still haunts the corridors of Buckingham Palace. She asserted that Charles had never truly recovered emotionally from that loss, and that guilt had quietly eroded his ability to lead during times of crisis. But the most shocking chapter of the letter concerned Camilla. The Queen did not make a direct accusation, but her words were heavy with cryptic foreboding about shadows gathering around Charles's care. She urged Catherine to stay vigilant, for in an institution that prioritizes image over the human being, the truth is often the first casualty. Catherine realized that she was no longer just a wife or a mother, but the last line of defense between the raw truth and a system desperate to protect a perfect facade. As the great clock in the castle continued to tick, Catherine understood that if the worn-out gears inside were not repaired, the entire royal machine would snap at the very moment the nation needed it most. While the Queen's secret letter provided the haunting historical context of Charles's fragility, the immediate crisis was being fueled by a modern war of information raging within the palace walls. For months, the official narrative had been one of successful recovery and planned procedures. But behind the heavy oak gates, a very different story was being whispered by those who saw the king every day. It began with the mention of unexpected complications, words that were never meant to reach the public ear. Yet, they began to circulate through the corridors of power like a slow-acting poison. As King Charles's health continued to decline in secret, a fierce ideological battle erupted between Prince William and the palace's senior advisors. The advisors, often referred to as the men in gray suits, remained obsessed with the optics of the monarchy. To them, the crown is an institution that must appear invincible. Admitting to a degenerative condition was seen by the old guard as an act of institutional suicide. They argued that transparency would only lead to public panic and a dangerous level of constitutional instability. William, however, found himself pushed to a breaking point. He was no longer willing to play the game of perception management while the people he loved were suffering in the shadows of protocol. The tension reached its peak when an internal email was reportedly sent to a high-ranking courtier. The subject line was as sharp as a blade. "She deserves more than silence." It was a direct challenge to the palace machine, a declaration that the human cost of these secrets had become too high to bear. Silence in a family is one thing, Catherine had argued during one of these heated confrontations. But silence in a public institution is another. The palace wasn't just managing health updates. They were trying to control reality itself, using privacy as a shield to delay the delivery of uncomfortable truths. But reality is a difficult thing to leash. When photos were questioned and schedules were cancelled without logic, the public's trust began to evaporate. The mask was slipping, and the fairy tale monarchy was being forced to admit it could bleed. The chilling warning from Queen Elizabeth's letter was no longer a ghost of the past. It was a blueprint for the tragedy unfolding in the present. As Catherine dug deeper, she encountered the eyes-only dossier, a medical report so sensitive that it was never digitized, kept only in physical form to prevent the inevitable leaks. The clinical language within those pages was devastating. It didn't speak of routine fatigue or rest. It spoke of a neurological condition that was degenerative, progressive, and, most damningly, present far earlier than the palace had ever dared to hint. This was the calculated omission that Catherine had feared, a deliberate decision by the palace machinery to prioritize the image of a strong king over the reality of a suffering man. The internal decline was now manifesting in physical signs that even the most expert PR team could no longer hide. In the world of royal analysis, we often look at the mask of protocol, but Catherine was looking at the man. She noticed the small stumbles during private receptions, the momentary blankness in his eyes during briefings, and the way his hands would tremble when he thought no one was watching. These were the maps of an internal struggle, the outward signs of an inherited vulnerability that was finally claiming its toll. For Catherine, seeing these signs was like watching a bridge crumble in slow motion, while the palace advisors continued to insist that the path was perfectly safe. The situation reached a breaking point during a quiet, closed-door reception. There were no cameras allowed, but the walls have ears, and someone was recording. King Charles, mid-sentence, lost his footing and collapsed. His expression was reported as blank, his body momentarily unresponsive. The panic among the aides was palpable. They didn't rush to help the man first. They rushed to block the view, to shield the king from the eyes of the staff. This was the moment the fairy tale died. It was no longer about a king serving his people. It was about a system serving itself, hiding a falling monarch to preserve an ancient, rigid image of power. When the footage eventually leaked to a small political blog, the palace's reaction was swift and sharp. Denial. They called it unverifiable, a malicious fabrication. But Catherine had seen the truth with her own eyes. She stood at the edge of a full-blown fury, watching the institution she had married into choose shadows over sunlight. She realized that the king was being turned into a placeholder, a puppet of protocol, while his actual health was being treated as a state secret. The rift between Catherine and the senior advisors, led by those loyal to Camilla, had now become an open war for the soul of the monarchy. The warning in Queen Elizabeth's hand was not just a diagnosis. It was a strategic alarm. "Stay vigilant," the late queen had urged, and as Catherine witnessed the palace's reaction to the king's collapse, She finally understood why. In the void left by Charles's deteriorating health, a new and formidable power had emerged. Camilla, the queen consort. She had become the ultimate gatekeeper, the one who controlled the king's schedule, his medical access, and the narrative released to the world. For months, the fracture between the king's wife and his heir, Prince William, had been a whispered rumor, but Catherine's discovery of the Queen's letter turned it into an open declaration of war within the palace walls. Camilla's strategy was as cold as it was effective. A regency in function, but not in name. She proposed a setup where she would serve as the king's official proxy, managing royal affairs while Charles remained resting in total privacy. To the public, it would look like a devoted wife supporting a tired husband. To the institution, it was a calculated move to centralize power and bypass the traditional line of succession. This was the shadow gathering that Queen Elizabeth had foreseen, a scenario where the crown's moral authority was traded for an image of control, managed by those who were not born to rule. The tension reached a fever pitch in the candlelit chambers of Windsor Castle. Catherine and William stood firmly against this proposal, refusing to let the monarchy be turned into a placeholder system. Catherine argued that the nation didn't need a gatekeeper. They needed a leader grounded in truth. The Regency Act of 1937 hung over the room like a guillotine, a constitutional provision that could formally transfer power if the king was found incapable. Invoking it would be a nuclear option, signaling to the world that the king was no longer a symbol of strength, but a man in decline. As the meeting fractured, the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the men in gray suits and those loyal to Camilla, desperate to preserve the image at all costs. On the other stood the future William and Catherine, who had realized that the crown is only safe when it is honest. The Queen's letter had given Catherine the moral weight to challenge the machine, but she knew that unveiling the full truth would come at a devastating cost to the family's unity. The silent war was no longer silent. The bridge between the past and the future was beginning to burn, and Catherine was the only one holding the flame. The air inside the palace had grown thin, suffocating under the weight of 1,000 lies. Princess Catherine stood in the center of the storm, watching as the institution she had dedicated her life to chose to prioritize a crumbling image over a dying man's dignity. The eyes-only dossier and the Queen's sealed letter were no longer just documents. They were evidence of a grand betrayal. Catherine realized that the senior advisors, with the silent blessing of the Queen consort, were not just managing a health crisis, they were managing a transition of power in total darkness. The silent war was about to have its first casualty, the palace's century-old protocol of secrecy. The moment of absolute clarity came when Catherine was told that her public appearances would be strictly scripted to avoid any questions about the king's neurological decline. It was a demand for her to become a puppet of the machine, to look into the cameras and lie to a nation that was already grieving. Her response was a cold, unwavering defiance that sent tremors through the palace hierarchy. She was no longer the compliant princess. She was a future queen consort who understood that a monarchy built on shadows cannot survive the sunlight. Catherine's fury was not born of ambition, but of a deep, visceral sense of justice. She had watched Prince William wrestle with the silence, torn between his loyalty to the firm and his love for his father. She saw the king being moved quietly, almost like a piece of furniture, to a private royal hospice, a move designed to hide the finality of his condition from the public eye. The Queen's letter had warned her, "Do not let the crown blind you to the truth." She realized that if she didn't speak now, the truth would be buried with the king, and the monarchy would lose its most valuable asset, the trust of the people. In a move never before seen in the history of the House of Windsor, Catherine decided to bypass the official press office. She knew that any statement passed through the traditional channels would be sanitized, diluted, and stripped of its humanity. She began preparing for the unthinkable, to speak directly to the world, without a podium, without a palace insignia, and without the permission of the advisors who had kept the nation in the dark. The stage was set for a reckoning that would either save the monarchy or fracture it forever. Catherine was no longer waiting for the gatekeepers to open the doors. She was about to tear them down. The moment the world had been half expecting, yet was entirely unprepared for, finally arrived. There was no fanfare, no royal insignia stamped on a grand podium, and no rehearsed introduction from a palace press secretary. Instead, Princess Catherine appeared in a setting so simple it felt jarringly intimate. She sat alone, the weight of the monarchy's crisis visible in the tired lines around her eyes and the unmistakable resolve in her voice. She wasn't speaking as a protected member of the firm. She was speaking as a daughter-in-law, a wife, and a future queen who had chosen honesty over the safety of tradition. Her first words hit the nation like a thunderclap. "The king is no longer the man we knew." It was a sentence that stripped away months of palace spin in a single breath. For the first time, a senior royal had dared to use the language of raw truth rather than the hollow reassurances of protocol. Catherine went on to describe, with painful clarity, the cognitive decline and the neurological battle that King Charles had been fighting in the shadows. She spoke of the emotional toll it had taken on the family, not just the king's physical suffering, but the agonizing struggle to maintain a facade of dignity while navigating a progressive tragedy. As she spoke, the world stopped listening to rumors and started hearing her pain. She admitted what the eyes-only dossier had tried to hide, that this condition was not temporary, and the road ahead would demand a level of unity and transparency the monarchy had never before shown. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media turned into a digital cathedral of solidarity, but beneath the support, a fierce reckoning was beginning. Why had the palace hidden this? Who had made the decision to keep the nation in the dark? Catherine ended her address not with a forced message of hope, but with a devastating reality that would be replayed on screens across the globe for days. "This is the fight of his life." With those words, she stepped back, leaving the palace advisors in a state of absolute chaos. She had broken the fourth wall of the monarchy, and in doing so, she had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic of the crown. The gatekeepers had lost their keys. The truth was no longer a secret, and the House of Windsor was now standing in the cold, bright light of public accountability. The aftermath of Catherine's address was not a peaceful resolution, but a total collapse of the old order. Within the stone walls of Windsor Castle, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to toxic. While the public mourned and rallied behind the princess, the men in gray suits, the senior advisors who had spent decades protecting the crown's secrets, found themselves in a state of unprecedented fury. Catherine's decision to bypass the official press machine wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was an act of institutional rebellion. For the first time in modern history, the image-makers had lost control of the narrative, and the rift between the next generation and the current queen consort had split wide open. The Windsor War Room became the stage for a silent, brutal battle over the future of the throne. Lines were drawn with chilling precision. On one side stood Camilla and the traditionalists, who argued that Catherine's transparency had destabilized the monarchy and invited dangerous levels of public scrutiny. They viewed the honesty not as a virtue, but as a fatal error. On the other side stood William and Catherine, supported by a growing faction of younger palace staff who realized that the age of secrets had to die for the monarchy to live. The Queen's sealed letter, once a hidden warning, was now the moral compass guiding William's every move. Constitutional lawyers were summoned to the palace in the dead of night. The Regency Act of 1937, a document rarely touched in a generation, was dusted off and analyzed under the microscope of crisis. The question was no longer if power would shift, but how it would be formalized without causing a total collapse of the sovereign's authority. Camilla's proposal for a proxy regency was met with sharp resistance from Princess Anne, the quiet but powerful voice of the late Queen's legacy. Anne reportedly called the plan manipulative, a calculated attempt to maintain the shadows that Catherine had just dispelled. As the legal battles raged, King Charles was moved quietly to a private royal hospice, a move that signaled the end of an era. Outside the gates, the people didn't gather to protest. They gathered to hold a vigil for a man they felt they were finally being allowed to know. The tragedy of the inherited vulnerability was no longer a state secret. It was a shared national grief. However, Even as the transition began, a final, handwritten envelope from Charles himself emerged, addressed only to Catherine. It was a letter that would reorder the power structure of the monarchy forever, containing a single line that would leave Catherine breathless and the queen consort isolated in the shadows of her own making. The atmosphere within the palace reached a point of absolute stillness when a single, handwritten envelope was passed through the halls, addressed only to Catherine. It was not delivered by a courier or a press officer, but by one of the king's most trusted personal aides, whose eyes were reportedly glassy as he whispered, "He finished it 2 nights ago." As Catherine opened the letter, she realized this was not a formal decree of the state, but a painfully human farewell from a man who had finally accepted his own fragility. Charles began not with justifications for the palace's silence, but with profound gratitude for Catherine's strength, the very honesty that the machine had tried so hard to suppress. The letter was a radical reordering of trust. Charles admitted that in his desperate attempt to protect the image of the crown, he had nearly weakened it beyond repair. He wrote with a trembling hand that the monarchy no longer needed gatekeepers or placeholders. It needed a leadership grounded in the truth that Catherine had dared to speak. But it was the warning near the end that sent a chill through the heart of the institution. Charles wrote, "There will be those who fight the truth to preserve their throne." He didn't need to name Camilla or the senior advisors. The implication was as sharp as a blade. The ghosts of ambition and the silent battles for control were being exposed by the king himself, effectively stripping the old guard of their moral authority. When the contents of the letter were revealed internally, the reaction from the queen consort was described by insiders as one of total devastation. Isolated and absent from all public duties, the fracture between her and the rest of the family had become a chasm that no protocol could bridge. Catherine didn't revel in this victory. She reportedly broke down upon reading the final underlined line, "The crown is safest in your hands." It was the ultimate transfer of moral weight, a legacy passed not through a legal document, but through faith in the one person who refused to let the crown blind her to the truth. Within 48 hours, the inevitable formal announcement was made. A regency would begin immediately. William would assume the king's duties with Catherine by his side as the nation's primary symbol of continuity. The king would remain sovereign in name, but the power had officially shifted to the next generation. As the sun set over the gray stones of Windsor, the world realized they weren't just watching a change in administration. They were witnessing the rise of a queen the world never saw coming, one who had saved the monarchy by having the courage to let it appear human. As the dust begins to settle over the gray spires of Windsor, the British monarchy finds itself standing on the threshold of an era that was never supposed to arrive this soon. The Regency is no longer a whispered contingency plan. It is a lived reality. Prince William has assumed the sovereign's duties, but it is the woman by his side who has redefined the very nature of the crown. Princess Catherine, by choosing to shatter the palace's culture of silence, has done what no advisor or courtier dared to do. She has traded the illusion of royal perfection for the power of human truth. The silent war inside the palace may have ended with a formal decree, but its lessons will resonate for decades. The queen consort, Camilla, remains a figure of the past, a symbol of the old guard that believed the monarchy could only survive through shadows and managed optics. In contrast, Catherine has become the architect of a transparent monarchy. The Queen's sealed letter, which started this entire journey, was not just a warning about Charles's health. It was a prophecy about the survival of the institution itself. Elizabeth II knew that a modern audience would no longer accept a fairy tale king. They demanded a monarch who could look them in the eye and admit to the same fragilities that haunt every human life. As King Charles spends his final days in the quiet peace of the royal hospice, away from the flashing cameras and the rigid demands of protocol, there is a sense of collective relief across the nation. The burden has been lifted not just from his shoulders, but from the institution. The inherited vulnerability that the palace tried so hard to hide is now the very thing that has reconnected the people to the throne. Catherine's courage to speak the words, "The king is no longer the man we knew," didn't destroy the monarchy. It saved it by making it real. The crown is indeed safest in her hands, as Charles so poignantly wrote. But safety in the modern age does not mean being hidden behind stone walls. It means having the moral weight to lead with honesty. As William and Catherine step into their roles as the de facto leaders of the nation, they carry with them the cedar box, the sealed letter, and a new blueprint for sovereignty. The age of secrets is dead. The age of the human crown has begun. Thank you for following this 10-part journey into the heart of the royal crisis. The throne has trembled, but in the hands of the Princess of Wales, it has found its steady ground once more.